Thank you, Mr. Reiss, Mr. Morris. We very much appreciate your appearance here this morning and the help that you've already given to our staff in this effort. The purpose of these hearings and the purpose of our commission, most importantly, is to draw the lessons from what happened and to see that they're applied immediately to make changes that will make us all more secure. And your role in this is essential, given the experience you've had both before 9/11 and working since that to apply these lessons. This is a very different period that we have. Every intelligence person inside and outside the government has told us that they are coming again. They are going to attack again here in the United States, and very likely New York is where it will happen again. We know that New York is at the top still of the priority list because we're facing an enemy whose principal goal is to create massive civilian casualties in the highest profile environment that they can. And so I'd like you to keep these factors in mind as you answer the questions here, because it's necessary to face up to difficult issues, to see that we can make the changes, to be ready when they come the next time. In a sense, New York is what we in the Pentagon used to call the forward edge of the battle area. And we have institutions that evolved very successfully really over many decades of dealing with civil disturbances, civil catastrophes, and civil threats. Now, for the first time, this city has to deal with a determined, organized, and relatively well-funded enemy that's targeted on this city. So I'd like to pursue two lines of questioning with you both. One is the issue of command and control, and the other is the issue of strategy. Let's start with strategy. The underlying strategy that the Port Authority and that all of the institutions of first responders have as the foundation of their policies is fight in place. And that made sense when we were dealing with fires, with other kinds of domestic disturbances. But there is good reason to believe that that is not a sufficient paradigm going forward for the planning of our crisis response. If for no other reason than every major incident that we've had since 9/11, no one will stay in place. They leave. And I wonder whether some of our basic assumptions that follow from that are legitimate. For instance, why were there no plans to deal with survivors above the level of a fire in a high-rise? And why were there no, particularly after the 93 incident where more than a dozen people were rescued by helicopters from the roofs of the World Trade Center, was there no contingency planning for using helicopters to rescue people? Could you address those two questions?
I'll start. Thank you, Commissioner. Let's take the last one first. On the helicopter rescues, the Port Authority Fire Safety Director attended a number of meetings between the New York City Police Department and the New York City Fire Department subsequent to the 1993 incident. And there was a lot of discussion about having a rooftop rescue protocol at that time, but the end result of those two emergency agencies was that rooftop rescue was not practical in a major emergency. 1993 was a rare day. Normally the rooftop of the World Trade Center, 1,368 feet up in the air, always had strong winds blowing across it. That day in 93, it was a snowy day and there were no winds, and somehow amazingly the helicopter pilots from New York City were able to land. They rappelled down, from what I understand, and knocked away a lot of the land mobile whip antennas that clutter the entire roof of one. The roof of One World Trade Center was basically an antenna farm. Every 3 or 4 feet, there was another whip antenna sticking up, besides the 360-foot TV mast and 2 60-foot auxiliary TV masts. The roof of 2 was a little less cluttered, but it still had an outside promenade deck and the Port Authority's 800 megahertz radio system, U.S. Coast Guard antennas, and FM broadcasters. And basically, we didn't have this protocol because we don't have the assets to remove people from the roof. So I accept the staff's report that we did not tell people that the roof was not a viable option. People may have had a false sense of security because a couple of people, and from what I've been able to find out, it was a total of 12 that were lifted off the roofs of 1 and 2 World Trade Center in 1993.
Well, what about going forward? Should there be a major helicopter vertical rescue for people caught above fires?
Well, I think that's best answered by the aviation experts and the fire prevention experts. Done a lot of reflection, a lot of investigation since this incident. Los Angeles requires a helipad on all the roofs of their new buildings. Basically, it was enacted into their code in the 90s. But even in Los Angeles, from talking to a very good friend who writes the fire safety plans for most of the skyscrapers around the United States, it's not meant for helicopter evacuation in a fire emergency. It's meant for earthquakes, to get the firemen into the building to do search and rescue. I'm concerned if you try and get people up to the roof of the building that we may have a scene like when the embassy was evacuated in Vietnam.
So what contingency, by the way, many people got out that way.
That's true.
But what about what other alternatives do you have for people trapped above the fire? Well, the fighting in place is not going to be sufficient.
Well, as the Commission knows, the Building Code Task Force here in New York City has recommended the hardening of all the elevator shaftways and all the fire stairwells. I don't know that you can fully protect against a major bomb, or God forbid if the new Airbus A380 ever attacks a building. What we followed was the protocol from the fire department of the city of New York that day. The floor wardens were told that if the stairways servicing the fire floor were compromised or they were unusual to fire or smoke, they could use the elevators in accordance with a very strict procedure. If they didn't service the fire floor, they could use those elevators. But we know that the elevators were also compromised and all knocked out. This was such an incredible event. We believe, though we don't know, that a lot of the elevators were knocked out because the building moved in excess of 10 feet, and we think that caused most of the safeties on the elevators to drop underneath. These safety devices that are meant in case an elevator rope breaks or something, that these shoes dropped and locked all the elevators in place. So the elevators were not able to be used. I don't have a lot of good answers. If you had another attack on the World Trade Center like this, what would you do if all the stairwells are compromised? The helicopters can only handle a few people at a time, even if they were able to land, and we heard the brave pilots on the tape earlier. I don't know how many people would get up.
Well, the Port Authority operates perhaps the most likely lucrative targets for the next attack from all reports we have. Are you satisfied, and I ask this of both of you gentlemen, with the lessons learned that are being applied to deal with, which I still assume is defend in place rather than evacuation, and in the airline terminals, in the tunnels, in the bus terminals? What has been changed that doesn't lead us to think the same chaos will ensue? For instance, we're told that Mr. Rescorla, who died, the Morgan Stanley security agent, had bitter differences with the Port Authority's policy of defend in place, and let the Port Authority know this in advance of the 9/11. And he, of course, disregarded totally the instructions to stay in place and evacuated virtually everyone in Morgan Stanley. And then following that, what disturbs us is to learn that less than a year ago, Morgan Stanley, in its new headquarters in Times Square, wanted to evacuate, to have a practice drill to evacuate rather than defend in place. and they had every obstacle put in. They were denied permission. They finally, after 3 months of trying, were able to get permission to do it only after they agreed to pay for the insurance for the building. This does not sound like applying lessons learned.
Well, Commissioner, I can't speak for Morgan Stanley's current landlord, but I think you've hit on a very important point on the lessons learned. The model codes that are used throughout the country, not only in New York City, but Chicago and Los Angeles and other major target cities, they haven't changed. They don't recognize the paradigm shift that took place that you spoke about, that this defend in place, the order to only evacuate the fire floors and a couple of floors below, everyone is going to leave that building. No one is going to listen to a fire safety director making an announcement that says, stay and let the other people evacuate first. Everyone, including myself, and we've had a couple of fires in the building that I'm now a tenant in, that fire alarm goes off and you smell smoke. Everyone is down the stairs instantaneously. And that's a major change, and the codes need to recognize it. The stairwell capacities have to be made wider. They have to recognize the fact that you're going to have this massive evacuation, which only complicates the fire department's command and control at the scene. I don't think a lot of people even recognize, and I think we need to do a better job in communicating not only to the floor wardens, but the tenants in the buildings, that when the fire department gets there and they begin to fight a normal fire, let alone a terrorist attack, that one of those fire stairs is going to be used as an attack stair. And that means that all the heat and the smoke and the toxic carbon monoxide is going to rise above that stairwell as a chimney going up. That stairwell essentially becomes non-usable above the fire floor, which leaves you only the other two stairwells to evacuate down. So there's a lot of changes that need to be made, and I really support what Columbia University is doing in NIST. There has to be a relationship between the communication and evacuation behavior. And I think perhaps because many of the people at the World Trade Center did not know what happened, they didn't have that situational awareness that the public did. If they knew what was going on, they may have actually panicked more. We were able to successfully get the people out in an hour, which is absolutely amazing to me. As I said in my written testimony, I really expected that people would have been trampled to death. It is a credit to the floor wardens and the individuals that day.
I'm sorry, I'm out of time, so you get off easy, Mr. Morris, but I'm sure we'll get into command and control in separate issues. And I would only close by saying I really get the impression that it's not exactly business as usual, but we're working within the old paradigms to fix things rather than recognizing that this is a very special situation that we're going to be in for a long time in this war against terror, and that we, particularly in command and control, are not even beginning to deal with the issues.